This video will teach you everything you need to know about restriction, fragment length, polymorphism, short tandem repeats, polymerase chain reaction, and CODIS. I will also talk about the story of our exoneree Anthony Capozzi, his conviction, and his exoneration. First of all, I will talk about RFLP and its steps. RFLP stands for Restriction Fragment Length Polymorphism, and it's a type of analysis used to identify a change in the genetic sequence which occurs at a site where a restriction enzyme cuts the DNA. Restriction enzymes are proteins isolated from bacteria. They recognize specific short sequences of DNA and cut the DNA sequence at these specific sites. The normal function of these enzymes in bacteria is to protect the organism by attacking foreign DNA, such as viruses. The steps of the RFLP is that first of all, the DNA is extracted from the blood cells, and then the restriction enzymes cuts the DNA according to its size, and then fragments of DNA are separated by electrophoresis, and then the DNA transfers its fragments onto a membrane, and then radioactive DNA probe binds specific DNA fragments. Then the membrane washes the excess probe, and then the X-ray film is placed on the DNA sample and switches the membrane to detect the radioactive pattern. And finally, the DNA extracted from the RFLP is used and compared to the DNA found at the crime scene to detect who the real criminal is. Short tandem repeats, or the STR, is a molecular biology method used to compare specific locations on the DNA strand using two or more samples of DNA. A short tandem repeat is consisted of a unit of 2 to 13 nucleotides represented hundreds of times in a row on a DNA strand. STR analysis measures the exact number of repeating units on the DNA strand. Polymerase chain reaction and short tandem repeats are related. The polymerase chain reaction is what discovers the lengths of the short tandem repeats in the STR analysis. STR has more advantages over the RFLP because STR analysis does not cut the DNA with restriction enzymes, which is something that the RFLP does. Instead, the STR probes are attached to desired regions on the DNA strand, and a polymerase chain reaction, which is known as the PCR, is employed to discover the length of the short tandem repeats. CODIS, or the Combined DNA Index System, is a computer software program that was created to operate local, state, and national databases of DNA profiles from convicted prisoners, unsolved crime scene evidence, and missing people. The purpose of CODIS software is to enable state, local, and national law enforcement crime laboratories to compare DNA profiles electronically, and therefore link serial crimes to each other and identify suspects by matching the DNA they found with DNA of convicted criminals from previous crimes. The success of CODIS is proved by the thousands of matches that have linked serial cases to each other, and also other cases that have been solved by matching crime scene evidence and DNA to DNA that was previously on the system from previous convicted criminals. That is because if a person killed or raped before, they might have the tendency to do it again and again. Anthony Capozzi was wrongfully convicted of committing two sexual assaults in Buffalo, New York, in the mid-1980s, and he spent over 2 decades in prison for these crimes before DNA testing proved his innocence and revealed the identity of the true perpetrator, who had gone on to commit multiple rapes and even murders while Capozzi was wrongfully imprisoned and in jail. Capozzi was imprisoned for 22 years, and his sentence was 11 to 35 years. He spent more than half of it until he was then set free. Between December 1983 and July 1984, several women were raped along the bike path in Delaware Park. Their attackers surprised each of them from behind, threatened them with a gun, raped them, and then told them to remain on the ground at the scene for another 10 to 20 minutes before fleeing. The victims in three of the attacks told the police that their attacker weighed about 150 to 160 pounds. Capozzi, however, weighed about 220 pounds and had 3-inch scar above his eye, which none of his victims mentioned in their descriptions, although it was obvious. Capozzi's schizophrenia, which is a long-term mental disorder, caused him to have strange behavioral patterns that a former police officer noticed at a coffee shop a mile from Delaware Park, which is where the victims were raped. The officer pointed investigators toward Capozzi as a possible suspect. He was placed in a lineup where the victims identified him as the rapist over a year after the actual attacks occurred. They obviously forgot how the raper looked like. There was no physical evidence linking Capozzi to the rapes. In 1987, Capozzi was convicted of 2 of the 3 rapes. He was sentenced he was sentenced 19 to 35 years in prison for 2 counts of first-degree rape. Although he was convicted as the bike path rapist, attacks continued in the area after Capozzi was prisoned. Starting in 1997, Capozzi appeared before a parole board every 2 years, but in order to be considered for release, he would have to admit guilt, show remorse or deep regret, and complete a mandatory sex offender program. He was unwilling to confess to a crime he did not commit. Capozzi stood by his innocence and was denied parole, which is the release of a prisoner temporarily from jail. He was denied his parole for 5 times because he didn't want to confess something he didn't do. In 2006, a woman got killed in the same place all the rapes have occurred in, along a side path in Buffalo, New York, under circumstances that resembled a string of serial rapes and murders in the area for the previous 20 years. The police believed had been committed by one individual because they all had the same method. DNA was then introduced, and DNA tests on evidence from the crime scene led authorities to suspect a guy called Altemio Sanchez, who would eventually plead guilty to the 2006 murder, 2 other murders, along with all the other rape cases. DNA evidence have from at least eight crimes has been linked to Shandez. Capozzi's attorney Thomas Augustino then renewed the search for DNA collected in the cases for which Capozzi has been convicted. The evidence that led to his exoneration was that authorities issued multiple subpoenas to the Erie Country Medical Center, which the rape victims were initially treated, for the rape kits from Capozzi's case. After being told repeatedly that the evidence has been damaged or destroyed, glass slides from the rape kits were finally located. The evidence that could exonerate Anthony Capozzi has been sitting in a drawer in the country hospital for over 20 years now. The exoneration results of the tests came back in April of 2007. The results excluded Capozzi and implicated Shandez. Within days, Capozzi's conviction was vacated and all charges against him were dismissed after 22 years in prison for crimes that he did not commit. After Capozzi's exoneration, Assemblyman Sam Hoyt and State Senator Dale Volcker passed a new legislation called Anthony's Law, which gave priority to claims for wrongfully convicted individuals seeking compensation from the state. Capozzi worked as a lawyer after his exoneration because his stay at the prison for 22 years made him know a lot of things about law, and also he got a compensation from the government, which was for $4.25 million. Although a lot of people think that the CODIS um, isn't a good thing and that it violates the privacy of a lot of people, I actually think that it's a very good thing because it keeps records for all the criminals, which makes it a lot easier to know who the real perpetrator is instead of wrongly convicting people and making them stay in jail for a lot of time. For example, uh, it might exonerate. He was put in jail for 22 years for eyewitness misidentification. He lost 22 years of his life in jail for a crime he didn't do. And of course, if the codex was already there, he wouldn't have stayed all of that time in jail for nothing. I also think it wasn't fair to put Capozzi in jail only for eyewitness evidence, because Capozzi was placed in a lineup in front of the victims 1 year after the crime was occurred, and they obviously forgot how the raper looked like, so they can just convict anyone. Thank you for watching my video. Dina El Sharkawy.